we've all seen the chart showing that more Europeans die from heat-related deaths than die from gun-related deaths in America. Here's my question du jour. Live in a world / a country where you have lots of guns and basically universal air conditioning, or no guns and no air conditioning.
It depends on where I'm geographically located.
Do the police have guns?
Wait.
I think in Europe, a lot of the police don't have guns.
Oh, so we're just talking about Europe versus
We're
the
talking
US.
about Europe versus America.
Oh, I'd rather live in the U.S.
Yeah. Also, I don't want to give up my guns.
That's true.
And I don't want to give up my air conditioner. Looks like we've got 3 Americans on a podcast. Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk, and we have a lot to discuss today. Shortly before we began taping, the Supreme Court released decisions in a couple of the cases we've been watching. In the late arriving ballots case, Watson versus the RNC, the court ruled that ballots postmarked by Election Day that arrive after Election Day can still be counted in states where that's legal. When it comes to independent agencies, the court ruled that Trump could fire Federal Trade Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter, but ruled that Federal Reserve member Lisa Cook could keep her job while she challenged her firing. This continues a trend that court watchers have suspected would play out, that the Federal Reserve has a special designation when it comes to independent agencies. Therefore, the court could expand the president's power over regulators without undoing the independence of the Fed. We'll dig into that and the late arriving ballots case on today's podcast. We're also going to discuss what Americans think about the Trump administration's deal with Iran, after all kinds of conflicting messages about what it entails and whether the war is actually even over. And we'll get into some of the latest midterm polling prompted by a listener question about tightening in the generic ballot. And we've got a good data, bad data, or not data example based on a Washington Post report suggesting that prediction markets are actually well calibrated. Here with me to discuss it all, we're running it back from Thursday's episode. We've got managing editor of Votebeat, Nathaniel Rakich. Welcome to the podcast, Nathaniel.
Thank you, Galen. I get first billing this time. Usually Mary gets first billing.
You know, gotta mix it up sometimes. I also know you've been hard at work this morning. We gotta pay credit where credit's due. Also here with us, head of research at 50+1, Mary Radcliffe. Welcome, Mary.
Hey, Galen. How's everything going?
It's going pretty well. Not too much has changed since last Thursday. I'll also say, for anyone who missed it, we had a lively debate about whether the left is in the midst of its own Tea Party on last Thursday's episode between Mary, Nathaniel, and myself, so go check that out. But let's begin with what Nathaniel has been up to this morning, which is dutifully writing about the Watson v. RNC case at the Supreme Court. So, Nathaniel, what happened?
Yeah, so in a decision that was somewhat of a surprise, although I think you could see the makings of it in some of the tea leaves to be read, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 with Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts joining the 3 liberals that it is totally fine for states to accept ballots after Election Day as long as they are postmarked by Election Day. So this case threatened to basically change the deadline for the receipt of mail ballots in 14 states plus DC. This includes states like California that famously accept ballots that arrive after Election Day and therefore kind of slowing down the count. But as a result of this ruling, status quo will reign, so election officials don't have to scramble to educate voters and kind of change all their procedures. At the same time, we are going to keep on getting results fairly late, and people like Donald Trump are going to continue to scream about it.
He's already screaming about it.
I'm sure. I have not checked Truth Social this morning, but I'm sure there were a couple areas of disappointment this morning. We won't even get into the E. Jean Carroll lawsuit. What was the rationale from Amy Coney Barrett for keeping the status quo?
So basically, the argument that Republicans, who were the ones who challenged these laws, were making was that Congress has set by federal statute Election Day as the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and therefore any counting or that happens after that is moot because Election Day is that day. But Amy Coney Barrett in her majority decision said, nope, The election day is for like the casting of ballots. It's not about the counting of the ballots. Obviously, there are many steps that happen after the actual voting on election day before results are certified, right? Ballots are counted, they are canvassed, they are audited, double checked. There are recounts that happen. Obviously, if a candidate were to challenge a result that was within like 5 votes or something in a recount, you can't do that recount on election day. That's obviously impractical. And so, it was basically a case about the meaning of election day and what needs to be done on election day. And the kind of more voting rights, voting access folks ended up winning the day.
This ultimately, though, comes down to statutes. So Congress could change this if it wants to. It's not a constitutional issue. Do you think that Congress will change the status quo?
No. And, Trump did respond to this ruling by calling on America for approximately the 14th billion time to pass the Save America Act. They will not do that because the votes are just not there in the Senate. It would require overriding the filibuster. And that is just, it seems pretty clear that is not going to happen. Trump has, as we've discussed, he has been trying to pull lots of levers. He's been trying to hold other bills like the housing bill hostage to get this done. So it's clear that it means a lot to him. But no, I don't think that anything is going to change. Trump has also tried to make this change via executive order last year, and that got struck down in court. So the system is holding in terms of people who might be worried about the impacts on the midterms. I do think it's interesting. Trump has been handed a lot of losses in court over the last 10 days on election law issues. He's had his attempts to get voter rolls from states rebuffed by multiple states or multiple judges in states. He has had his second executive order regarding kind of more closely regulating mail ballots. That has been blocked in court. His use of the SAVE system to verify or look for non-citizens on voting rolls has been blocked in court. So I can imagine that the president is probably pretty angry and this is motivating him. At the same time, I think it is notable that the pieces are coming into place for Trump to be able to blame other actors, Congress for not passing the Save America Act, the Supreme Court for not, siding with him on the Watson v. RNC case. If and when Democrats end up winning the midterms, he can say, well, there was all this fraud, all these ballots arrived late, mail votes, were continued to be rampant, even though I tried to fix it. That may be a potent political argument, even if legally speaking, it's not having any teeth.
So are you saying that that's an off-ramp for Trump trying to sort of fuck with the midterms? Or you're saying be on guard because Trump is going to try to fuck with the midterms?
Both, right? I mean, it's predicting Trump is obviously a futile exercise, right? He could end up being so angry that none of his things are working that he'll be more motivated to take one of the actions that he can theoretically do, although it would be illegal, sending troops to polling places or something like that. But at the same time, he might just decide, hey, this benefits me politically. He has a very useful foil in Congress and in the Supreme Court right now. And if the goal is to try to overturn the election again after the fact, then, maybe he will stay quiet until then. But we don't really know. I don't want to make any predictions.
I've been victimized by John Cornyn and Amy Coney Barrett. So if you're mad about the outcome of the midterms, be mad at them.
Right.
Not the war in Iran or anything like that.
Yeah. And in fact, the war in Iran is super popular and I would have won if not for these people.
Got it.
I just want to throw in also that on the Save America Act, I don't think he has the votes in the Senate, even if they did nuke the filibuster. There were 4 Republicans that voted with Democrats against cloture on the bill. So I just don't think they have the votes, even if they did nuke the filibuster.
Yeah. And just to add some clarification to the independent agency's case, for folks who might be confused about why the Fed is different, you don't have to believe or agree with this argument at all. But conservatives argue that these independent agencies or regulators are exercising executive power. So they sue people, they make binding rulings, they bring enforcement actions. And as such, the president has power over that activity. Conservatives argue, however, that the Fed is sui generis. It is, quote, a uniquely structured quasi-private independent entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States. So that is how the court could weaken the independence of the agencies while preserving the independence of the Fed. Liberals say that this is bullshit and that both the agencies, the independent agencies and the Fed should remain independent.
Well, it's actually in the Cook case, which is the Fed case, right? That was actually the liberals who were joining with John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh to keep Lisa Cook in her job. So actually, I think the liberals are on that side of it. Of they want the Fed to
they want the Fed to remain.
They want Trump to
but
not
they
have
don't
the power to fire these people.
They don't buy the argument that the Fed is unique. They say the independent agencies and the Fed are both covered. Well, they say the independent agencies and the Fed are probably both covered by Humphrey's executor, which is no longer, I guess, in existence now, or certainly no longer covers the independent agencies.
Right.
And that this idea has been sort of craftily assembled so that conservatives on the court could both weaken independent agencies while not weakening an independent Fed, because that is a pillar of the monetary system that we have.
Right, but what I'm saying is that it's not conservatives on the court. It's actually specifically just John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh. They are the only two people who are inconsistent.
Right. Okay, yes.
I think that's important because I think they are the two kind of most business-friendly type of like Reagan Republican people on the court, right? Gorsuch and Barrett, for sometimes they can be idiosyncratic, like in the Watson case, but I think they're a little bit more kind of like intellectually and ideologically driven. And then obviously Thomas and Alito are pretty far to the right. So I think that is notable, that like the camps are pretty clear. Most people want one way or all the other way, but it was just those two justices who were kind of splitting the baby here.
If it were up to the other four conservative justices, the Fed would also not be independent.
Right.
So just to round this out, tomorrow is scheduled to be the last day of the Supreme Court's term, meaning we're going to get decisions in the remaining 4 cases, including birthright citizenship and bans on trans women in women's sports in the states. So be on the lookout for that. Perhaps we'll discuss it later this week.
I'll put in a plug too. The 4th remaining case is a fairly important campaign finance case that could remove limits on parties spending in coordination with candidates, which kind of similar to how Citizens United and other cases open the door to more money in politics. This could do that too. So it's actually going to be a pretty big day tomorrow at the court.
It's a big day. Thank you for keeping me honest. Mary, somebody on the podcast mentioned that Trump would talk about how, in fact, popular the Iran war was, and if it weren't for all of this stuff, would have helped at the midterms. So let's address that question, because it's been a minute since we've talked about Americans' perception of the war and now the peace, in quotation marks, which doesn't really seem to be holding. Starting Thursday and into the weekend, the U.S. and Iran exchanged fire near the Strait of Hormuz, though the Trump administration says that continued peace talks are on schedule for Tuesday. We'll see how that pans out. At the moment, Iran has not necessarily said that that's the case. It's been almost 2 weeks, though, since Trump signed the Memorandum of Understanding with Iran at the Palace of Versailles, meaning, as these things go, it's a pretty good time to check in on how Americans are reacting to it all, understanding that this is all still in flux. Before we do that, and Mary has written about this, so we're going to ask the Queen of Polls to sort of bless our understanding here. But before we do that, I'll just cite briefly what was included in the memorandum. So it's a 60-day window extendable by mutual agreement to negotiate a final deal, immediate permanent end to military operations on all fronts, including Lebanon. That, of course, has already been violated in many ways. The U.S. to fully end its naval blockade of Iran within 30 days and withdraw forces from Iran's proximity within 30 days of a final deal. The Strait of Hormuz reopened, toll-free per Trump, though Iran still requires ships to clear its own newly created Persian Gulf Strait Authority. U.S. Treasury to issue waivers for Iranian crude oil and petroleum exports, plus associated banking, insurance, shipping services immediately upon the memorandum's signing. About $24 billion in frozen Iranian assets to be released, half before the final talks, half tied to implementation. And then Iran pledges, quote, not to procure or develop nuclear weapons, the same language as the 2015 Iran deal, with substance on that deferred to the 60-day talks, such as any binding nuclear verification mechanism. Okay, that's a lot. Mary, what do Americans think about that? I'm sure that pollsters are reading respondents exactly what I just read for listeners.
Well, what's interesting is, you can look at the question wording on some of these polls and see really real differences in support for at least the Memorandum of Understanding. So I'm going to kind of break this up into little buckets of would they support the ceasefire and the deal, the MOU as it stands? Do they support the ideas inside of it and how they think this is going to look in the future? Those are sort of the 3 sort of zones. As far as the MOU, I have yet to see a poll with the fact of signing the MOU being underwater, however a pollster asks it. Americans want this war to stop. And so signing a ceasefire that at least temporarily stops it is generally more favorable than unfavorable. Question wording makes a huge difference. So, for example, YouGov Economist had a pretty neutral question wording here, just like, do you support the preliminary Iran deal or something like that? They came out with 32% support and 24% opposition. But if you look at some of the earlier polls that were conducted immediately afterwards, they provided a little information about the MOU. So there was a poll from Qantas Insights, for example, that mentioned in the question language that the MOU would stop hostilities and reopen shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And when you give that extra information, we've got 56% approval and 13% disapproval. So there's a lot of variation, but no matter how you slice it, I have yet to see a poll with the MOU underwater. The difference often is really in the undecideds, frankly.
Yeah, and I think that is the key, right? As we know, Americans are not following every single twist and turn of the negotiations. They know only the broad strokes of foreign policy, if that. And I think that in particular, right, Mary cited the YouGov poll. The number of undecideds on that was 44%, which is obviously a very large
plurality
amount. Right, exactly. More people than supported or opposed the deal. And the Qantas one, still had a decent number of undecideds, although fewer, which makes sense given that they kind of provided a little more information. So I think it is important to note that Americans do not have a firm position on this. And I think that their support for the agreement is probably just born from the fact that the one thing that most Americans know about the war is that they don't like it. And
yes,
so anything that ends it is good.
Agree.
They don't know what's in this deal, but they know that it ends the war or hopes to end the war.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And when you look at like what is actually in it, there are some things that Americans like and some things that they don't like, right? Like limiting Iran's nuclear capacity is by and large quite positive if that is an outcome we're able to achieve here. So in that YouGov Economist poll, 69% said they supported that policy, 8% did not. Okay, so
would love to get a member of that 8% on the podcast.
Yeah. So that's like enormously popular. Reopening the strait is very similar numbers, 69% in favor, 6% opposed. But Americans are a little like less sure and less supportive of some of the other stuff in here. So in terms of lifting sanctions on Iranian oil, that only gets 41% support and 27% opposition. Again, you can see those undecideds went up there, and it's much closer. And that reconstruction fund, the alleged $300 billion reconstruction fund, is deep underwater, 23% in favor, 46% opposed. There's also, in that Qantas Insights poll from last week, there's a piece of the MOU that would require Iran to remove or destroy its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. They're currently discussing a method that would require like downblending it so it's less highly enriched. 63% in that survey said they would approve making this a condition of any eventual agreement. And this is going to be a really difficult sticking point because it's not clear if it's like possible to do this. The highly enriched uranium is like under a mountain of rubble from when we struck Iran last year. To have 63% saying they strongly approve of making this a ultimate condition of the agreement, that is like a warning sign for me that like whatever we are able to accomplish here is probably not going to satisfy what Americans think they want. They also probably don't care that much about those details.
Exactly.
Okay. So the thing that I find kind of worrying in the polling right now is how Americans are viewing what could be the future after the negotiation period. Generally speaking, Americans do not think that this is going to work. So Quinnipiac was out with a survey last week where 59% said they are not confident that this will work. And in that 59%, 40% said they are not at all confident, whereas the other 19% are like not very confident. So
wait, so not confident that the memorandum will lead to a broader deal, or not confident that the memorandum will actually even result in 30 to 60 days of peace?
Or not confident that like Iran will hold up its end of the bargain.
Yeah.
So the question was quite vague. It just said, how confident are you that President Trump's deal with Iran will work?
helpful.
Okay.
But I mean, listen,
maybe that's then just a poll on people's views of Trump.
There are other polls, though, that I think suggest that's more or less correct. So, for example, immediately, like the day after the MOU was announced, RMG Research and Neapolitan News Service was out in the field. And so this is like in all of the shiny good news headlines moments of like, we got a deal signed. They asked respondents if they thought the war was very likely, somewhat not likely, or definitely not likely to end in the near future. Right? So is this war going to end in the near future? That's it. That's the whole question.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Only 47% said yes. 41% said no. I mean, these are slightly different questions than will this work? But like, even in the shiniest, happiest moments in the immediate aftermath from a slightly GOP-leaning pollster, there's only a margin of 6% on whether this war is going to end in the near future. So
that's interesting.
Yeah. Americans are not super confident about this. And the last thing I want to mention is that we see in polls from both Ipsos Reuters and from YouGov, Americans think this is a better deal for Iran than for America, generally speaking. So I'll just cite the YouGov survey. When asked whether Iran will be better off than it was before the conflict or worse off than it was before the conflict, 36% say Iran will be better off, and 18% say it'll be worse off. Everyone else is a not sure or no change.
Mm-hmm.
But for America, 31% say it'll be better off, 5 points less than say the same for Iran. 27% say it will be worse off, 9 points more than say the same for Iran. So generally speaking, people think that Iran won at least the negotiation here. Not by a lot. There's a lot of not sures in there. Again, it's foreign policy, but that's where we're at.
I think a lot of listeners will be interested in this on face value, how Americans are reacting to the war with Iran, the quote-unquote peace with Iran, etc. I think a lot of listeners are probably also just curious how this is shaping Americans' perspective of the Trump administration, what it all means for the midterms. So I'm going to move us in that direction towards the national environment with a question from Andre, who says, can you please talk about the recent tightening in the generic ballot polls? Is it real? Also, do we see any other metrics supporting this tightening? Which is, I think, a question about, is Trump or Republicans becoming a little more popular than they were during the depths of this war? And I will say, we can get into generic ballot polling, presidential approval polling. At the very least, oil prices have been falling. So maybe if we think that there's a really close relationship between oil and gas prices and presidential approval or approval of Republicans, we could be on the lookout for some movement there. What are you all seeing in the data?
Well, when it comes to presidential approval, at our 50+1 polling average, we had Trump at his lowest at negative 24 percentage points underwater. He's up to negative 22 percentage points underwater right now. So there is a 2-point shift since the lowest lows, which were like during the depths of the conflict. That's not like...
And I'll say that is backed up, I would say, by some other aggregators that don't have exactly... So like Silver Bulletin, it moved from net negative 20 to net negative 18. The New York Times moved from net negative 22 to negative 20. So I think we are seeing like a shift of 2 percentage points on net across the different aggregators, even if the top line is a little bit different. So that does suggest maybe a little bit of movement.
Yes. It absolutely does suggest a little bit of movement in the president's favor. I don't know that there's like a really big difference between a negative 22-point polling average and a negative 20 or negative 24-point polling average when it comes to how people view the president. All of those versions seem quite bad.
Yeah.
So like it may be, yes, a little bit of support coming back to Trump in the wake of the MOU. Whether it stays there or not, I don't know. As to the generic ballot, I don't actually think that there's been any movement that's significant enough to discuss, at least on the 50+1 polling average. We did at one point have Democrats ahead by 7. They're now ahead by 6. They dropped to 5 at some point and moved back up to 6, right? Like these things are jiggly and noisy. We are still in a moment of the campaign where many pollsters have not turned on their likely voter models. we are still in a moment of the campaign where we have quite a few undecideds in the polling still. This is going to continue to be jiggly and noisy for a little while. So, like voter opinion really starts baking in. Like we can say something more in like mid-September, right? Until then, jiggles of a point or two here and there, I would just set them aside.
Jiggles of a point or two, the Mary Radcliffe story. No, not a good name for a memoir. Yeah, I mean, and I think I've looked across Silver Bulletin, DDHQ, et cetera, and we have seen movement. I mean, Andre is seeing something real, and I think they specifically cited the movement of a point in the Silver Bulletin average from a 7-point advantage for Democrats to a 6-point advantage for Democrats. So at least what they're noticing is that we're not seeing a continued trend in favor of Democrats at the moment. Nathaniel, do you have thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Mary. All these different aggregators use slightly different methodologies. And if there is a genuine change in public opinion, it's going to be obvious. It's going to show up in everybody's aggregation. And if there's like a little bit of noise in one person's average, but it's fairly steady in another person's average, it's probably just kind of like a mirage of the data. And I completely second everything that Mary said about like, it's early, don't get too worked up. I think what people are really, the real question that Andre and people who are looking at these averages are wondering is, I would assume, like, which party is going to win the midterms, or like, is my party going to win the midterms? And like, whenever, if you're a Democrat and you see your standing go down by a point, what you're really wondering is like, oh, is that going to go down to like, even, and then are we going to be screwed? Or, vice versa if you're a Republican. And I think that it's too early to tell. I completely agree that like -20 and -22 approval is basically the same thing. +6 and +7 for Democrats those are both very good years for Democrats. And just bear in mind, folks, the average error for national polls is like 4 points. And so we are not talking about huge movement here. Like the polls can we could go into election day with Democrats being up by 8 points and they might only win by 4, and that would be completely normal. So just don't obsess too much about those small movements and those decimals.
And given that the listener wrote in and they used the word tightening, I'm going to make what is perhaps a wrong assumption that you are a leaning Democrat voter looking for some cope. If you want some, we did recent analysis at 50+1 looking at the generic ballot in each of the last 3 midterms. We found that where Democrats are now is better than where they were at the same point in the cycle in 2018, and that the percentage of Democrats planning to vote for a Democrat this year is higher than we have seen among any party voting for their own party in the last 3 midterms. Democrats are so on board. Republicans are less on board, but also generally on the high side for wanting to vote for their own party relative to other midterms. But if that helps.
That's interesting. That's a little narrative busting too, because we've been talking about how dissatisfied Democrats are with their own party. But That's very interesting.
Well, there's been a lot of agreement here. So let's bring in something a little bit spicier, which is the New York Times latest poll out of Maine. Monday morning, they released a survey of the Susan Collins-Graham Plattner race showing Graham Plattner leading Collins 49-47, which is within the poll's margin of error, and suggested some troubling signs for Plattner underneath the hood. So they asked a couple questions about views of the candidates overall. One was, is this candidate too extreme? 47% said that Plattner is too extreme. Only 34% said Collins is too extreme. They asked, does this candidate have good character? 44% said that Plattner did. 66% said that Collins did. Does this candidate have the right kind of moral values? 45% said Plattner did. 61% said that Collins did. Now, first of all, people may think, well, that's a contradiction. Why does the poll sort of overall, the top line numbers favor Graham Plattner if people think he's too extreme and doesn't have good character? Well, let me remind you of Donald Trump, somebody that people broadly viewed as being extreme and not having good character. but was still able to get enough votes to win elections, because that is not the only thing that people vote on. And we've talked about this on the podcast already, that basically Graham Plattner's job will be to nationalize this race and make it look like a referendum on Trump. And Susan Collins' job will be to remind people that, like, hey, I brought in all this money for Maine. I'm, you know me, you can trust me. I have, again, good moral character, etc. But, New York Times 2-point race for one of the top tier races that we're going to be watching this fall. What are your takeaways from these results?
This is going to be a close one.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one poll. We'll put it on our pile of polls. But it jives with the data we have to this point, which is this is going to be a close one. I don't know if there's anything more to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think this is, like you said, Galen, it's a push and a pull between the partisanship of Maine and the national forces at play versus the individual candidates' factors. Collins is not particularly beloved in Maine anymore, but she does kind of score higher on those, trust and and moral code questions.
Yeah, just to throw in, the poll had her favorability underwater by 2 points and Plattner's favorability underwater by 5 points.
Right. So this is another kind of like double haters race, and not to bring back that that term from 2024, but it does make me think. I don't think that Graham Plattner's troubles are over. I think there are probably going to be more stories that drop between now and Election Day. There is still the outside possibility that there'll be something so bad out there that he'll drop out of the race and Democrats will appoint a new candidate. I tend to think, given these numbers, that a kind of generic Democrat, somebody without baggage, somebody like Shanna Bellows, the Secretary of State, or Troy Jackson, would be able to beat her by a fairly healthy margin. But we don't live in that world right now. So yeah, with the kind of field as we see it and the data as we have it, I agree with Mary that this is a toss-up.
I do think of this poll as a little bit of a wake-up call for Democrats amidst the delirium of primary season, because folks have been looking at a lot of races where it's Democrats versus Democrats and drawing conclusions about, sometimes, not responsibly so, but drawing conclusions sometimes about the direction of the country or the parties or whatever. And this is a poll that targets everybody in the state. Democrats, it's likely voters. So it could be Democrats, Republicans, and independents. People from a state that is not super ideological. Yes, it leans left, but it is not Massachusetts or Alabama. And you can see in this poll that probably some of the policy positions and values that we were talking about on last week's podcast as being, championed by the Tea Party of the left, or the burgeoning Tea Party of the left, or the something entirely different of the left, probably the country as a whole is not on board.
Sure. I also think that Graham Plattner has his own issues that are not ideological, right? All of his scandals. And that, I think, is certainly weighing into it. But no, I don't disagree with anything you said.
Yeah, I think this race is going to be probably not the one that I would want to look at to declare the progressive left as not being able to appeal to the electorate at large because of Plattner's specific personal issues, right? This is not an ideological fight in the same way that you might see in other districts around the country, just because it's all complicated by the fact that there's candidate quality issues.
In some ways, as elections watchers and politics watchers, what we really want is for Abdul El-Sayed to win the primary in Michigan. And then you have
that would be an interesting one,
a top tier battleground state, top tier battleground state, an out and out progressive, unabashed progressive winning there and going toe to toe with a viable Republican.
Yeah, candidate. A normie
Republican candidate. And then we've got a test on our hands. I think,
agreed.
I'm sure there will be some people listening who don't want that to happen, but from a let's really test some of these theories, especially in a super blue environment or presumably super blue environment, that would be really, really interesting.
Yeah. Agreed. That race is a weird mess, though, by the way, Michigan.
You mean the primary or the general?
The primary.
Don't worry, Mary, we're going to talk about Mary is currently a Pennsylvanian, but she is ancestrally a Michigander, to be clear.
Our former colleague Cooper Burton is also a Michigander, and we text about the Michigan Senate primary like constantly.
GD Politics is powered by you, the listeners. If you enjoy the show, the data-driven analysis, the genuine curiosity and lack of partisan BS, and yes, sometimes the silliness too, please consider becoming a paid subscriber at gdpolitics.com. Paid subscribers help make the podcast possible, and they also get twice the number of episodes and access to the paid subscriber chat where you can send me whatever questions you've got. Independent political media only works if the people who value it support it. So if GD Politics is part of your week, head to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber. That's gdpolitics.com. I so appreciate it. Thank you. There's one more thing to note about this Times poll, which is they start to make some methodological changes that preview greater methodological changes coming at the Times. This is pretty wonky, but we do have a former math teacher on the call. So this is as good a time as any to try to understand some of those changes, which are, they say, just to kind of contextualize all of this, they say that they've seen a trend where gold standard pollsters are the most rigorous in trying to reach everybody, oftentimes, but they sometimes aren't using the more advanced sort of weighting mechanisms or methodological mechanisms that people who actually work in politics are using. So they say that their goal is to use the absolute best practices in terms of trying to reach voters, but because that's not enough, they're also going to use the more wonky, highfalutin politics operator mechanisms for like deciphering those numbers once they come in.
Yeah. So there's two big changes here. One of them is actually not that big of a change, I think. It's a slight tweak to an existing method, which is to use a new variable called, they're calling the support score in their weighting. This is in place of 2024 recalled vote. So when you ask people, who did you vote for in the last election, studies routinely show that people lie or forget. If the politician they voted for has become unpopular, they may manifest a memory of voting for somebody else.
Or not voting at all.
Or not voting at all. If they voted for someone who lost, they may manifest the memory of having voted for the winner. I always liked that guy. And so rather than relying exclusively on 2024 recalled vote, the Times is using this new variable, which it includes recalled vote as part of how they calculate it, but it's actually an estimate of how likely that voter is to have supported Trump, Harris, or not voted based on their demographic characteristics and partisan characteristics and how they answer the 2024 recall vote. So they're basically accounting for the fact that you might be wrong about how you voted, whether that's intentional or not. The second change is how they are actually computing weights. And I'm going to apologize, folks, because I'm going to get so nerdy for a second. The normal way that we typically calculate weights in a survey is what's called raking, or iterative proportional fitting. If you would prefer, I will call it raking. Here's what we do. For all those characteristics that you want to weight by, they'll be like race, gender, age, education, whatever it is, whatever the characteristics are, you set a goal for how much of your survey should match each characteristic. If you're in Maine or whatever, maybe you want it to be 80% white and 15% black, whatever the characteristics of Maine are.
If Maine is 15% black.
I don't know. I'm making stuff up over here.
If you've ever been to Maine, you know that it's not 15% black.
I've never been to Maine. Not convinced it's a real place.
You should go.
So you set the targets, the goals for each of those groups. And then you go and you ask all your questions, you get your responses, and you don't have 80% white like you wanted. Maybe you only have 65% white. Whatever. So you go through each of those targets and you adjust how much you weight each respondent based on each of those target characteristics. And then you get a new weight and you look at it and say, is it representative now? And if it's not, you do that again. And you keep going, making slight adjustments at every stage until you get a final weight that's close enough to the target distribution. Now, this can guarantee you get enough white people. And it can guarantee you get enough young people and you get enough women and you get enough college-educated people. But what it does not do is guarantee you get enough young, white, college-educated women. When you put those buckets together, this method is not going to ensure that those individual parts of the electorate are well represented. And we can't really set those as targets in our variable set because the populations are too small. The sample sizes will be way too small. So we won't have enough young, white, college-educated women in the sample probably, or at least some of those buckets, we won't have enough people for this to be reliable. So what the Times is doing is using this very new methodology, which is called
energy shifting, energy
balancing.
What is it called?
Energy balancing. I found this
Deep
described
breaths,
in a paper. I found this described in a paper from 2024, so it appears to be quite new as a technique. If you are a real sicko out there and you want to Google this, you will have to add a mathy word to your Google search. You can't just go for energy balancing because you will get like some chakra stuff. Like if you throw in the word distribution, that should work. Basically, the idea is this. Since we can't weight every little bitty tiny bucket in the population, what we'll do is we'll do the iterative proportional fitting. We'll do that raking process. We get a distribution. And then we're going to use like a fancy math technique for looking at how far is this distribution overall, the whole thing, from the actual distribution we want overall. So rather than looking at individual respondents, this is a holistic measure. We're saying you have a distribution of shape goal and you have a distribution of shape what we've done so far. And if they're too far apart from each other, we will move what we've done so far closer to what the actual goal is in a holistic way rather than on the individual demographic buckets. This is very interesting, and there's lots of integrals, so it's really fun for anyone who used to teach calculus. But this is fascinating, and it is, like I said, very emergent technique, right? Very new.
Yeah.
And it pushes us closer to this idea that we've been talking about for a while, which is that increasingly pollsters are modelers, right?
Yep.
Because in order to do this, you have to project what you think the electorate is going to look like, and then you massage your number. I mean, I don't want to say massage in a way that sounds flippant or whatever, but you kind of scientifically massage. You know, this is more of a sports medicine massage than a, I don't know, Reiki massage. But ultimately, you're still
even though
massaging.
It is called energy balance.
Yeah, exactly. Ultimately, you're sort of massaging what you have to look something more like what you expect, which I totally understand why pollsters have been freaked out by the direction of the industry and misses and repeated misses in the same direction. And I understand the motivation to do this. There's like a lot riding on getting this stuff right. It is also a little bit worrying because it blends together, and this was already happening. So like, I'm not trying to like be a fearmonger, but it blends together what we see out in the world with sort of what we expect the world to look like, and makes it harder to see the difference between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. Although, I mean, a likely voter model has always relied on pollsters doing some modeling of the electorate.
Yes.
Unless the pollster is using the laziest definition of a likely voter, which is like, I asked you if you're going to vote and you said yes. Which some pollsters do, right? Like,
and Seltzer famously did.
Yes, Marquette Law School does, right? So like, okay, fine. That's a great pollster, right? Just to be clear. And maybe that's accurate. Like, okay.
Is this good data, bad data, or not data? Nathaniel, I see you've been I see you're ready to go.
No, that's the key question. Right. I mean, I think so for me, you know, I'll let Mary speak for herself. Obviously, she's much more knowledgeable on this stuff than I am. Like, this is certainly above my pay grade, right? As Mary said, this is some real cutting edge shit. And like, I think I am inclined to say good data because I think it is good when pollsters experiment, try to innovate, try to find solutions to these problems that are plaguing the industry. I think the folks who are running the Times Siena poll are very smart, and I trust them when they say that, they think this is going to make their surveys better. And in fact, we should note that they didn't just be like, oh, this might work, let's try this next time. They back tested it rigorously on their past polls and found that it would have made them slightly better, not by a huge amount, but this is not going to be some big huge change that is forever going to fix the polling industry. But they did see modest improvements when they looked and when they applied this method to previous polls. So I am inclined to think it's a good thing that they are iterating or are innovating, and I'm eager to see how it works out.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that analysis. The article that they wrote about this, it indicated that it improved their 2024 surveys by about 1 or 2 points. As Nathaniel said, that's not earth-shatteringly better, but I would love data to be 1 or 2 points more accurate than it is.
Yeah.
Can I bring up something slightly more esoteric that I think will ultimately indict some of the work that I've done on this podcast, maybe some of the work that we've all done, which they say that in doing this, they're incorporating more of the ways that campaigns classify voters, that this is kind of some of the methodology that campaigns have been using.
I think that's a reference to the support score, right? That's something that campaigns have used for a long time to model, oh, this person who lives at, 123 Fake Street, should I go knock on their door and get them to vote? But based on the demographics, I think they're likely to be a supporter of mine. The energy balancing stuff seems totally new. As far as I know, I don't think there's no reason for campaigns to use that stuff.
No, I have seen no reference to this.
Yeah.
At least none that I recall until this New York Times article.
And I do wonder, this doesn't mean it's bad for the New York Times to necessarily do this, but it increasingly endorses this world that campaigns have already endorsed, and we in the polling observer world and election watcher world have also endorsed. We just increasingly talk about the world as these predetermined sets of groups. The whole, we need to make sure we have the right proportion of young white college-educated women, not just blah, 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 blah. And it is representative of increasingly the ways that campaigns think they need to talk to voters as more groups than a whole. And I think that it makes it harder sometimes to create space for our society to find common bonds or to talk to our country as a whole. And that over time it becomes a feedback loop. That if we're always talking to you as your subgroup or trying to find the subgroup that you belong to in order to categorize you in our political analysis or appeal to you as part of a political campaign, you sort of increasingly see yourself as that group. And it makes it harder. I do think that politicians almost always are lying when they say they don't have a pollster, they don't look at the polls. But there is something powerful about being able to sense or talk about something that can appeal to everybody. And, I think the best politicians do that, despite probably still having data teams that are doing this stuff behind the scenes. I think Barack Obama is a good example of somebody who really talked to Americans as a whole group, even though he did have one of the he had the most advanced data team in presidential political campaigns at the time. So I just worry sometimes when we get too carried away with who we are as groups and not who we are as a whole. And here I'm getting more esoteric. I'm not just talking about accuracy. It could jeopardize accuracy when we do see shifts in the electorate where groups who have historically done one thing, so a realignment, if you will, it can jeopardize accuracy, but it also, I think, jeopardizes harmony.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to have to disagree at least somewhat when it comes to how we think about polls, right? This is not micro-targeted advertising. We're not trying to send a message to anyone. In fact, we're doing the opposite thing when we're doing polls. We're trying to understand how the electorate is, right? So, we knew in advance of the 2024 election and found ourselves this to be confirmed that there was going to be changes in certain demographic subgroups, that they're not some sort of monolithic thing that's always going to be the same and have the same opinions. We learned from the pre-election polling using scientific methodology to ensure that we represent a sample of Americans that looks like the electorate, that the Hispanic vote was going to shift towards Republicans in 2024. And then that happened. And now we're learning in polls because we are doing really good science to reach voters and understand their opinions, that some of that those gains are going to be clawed back, right? Like, this is a different thing than how you message to these voters. This is about understanding what the electorate is. So I don't know. I think actually, like, if you don't try to make sure that your sample meets these demographic quotas in your survey, you're going to have a worse understanding of America.
In fact, this kind of data can put a check on certain stereotyping and the like.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that, I think that go for it, New York Times, do this. I think it's valuable. I think the fact for me that when I read that, like, we're incorporating the way that campaigns classify voters, it reminded me of something that makes me sometimes uncomfortable about American politics, and maybe sometimes makes me uncomfortable as even an analyst of American politics, that we are, and look, the vast majority of Americans are not listening to podcasts, this podcast or podcasts like it at all. And so they're not thinking about people as their census-driven category or whatever, you know. But to the extent that that kind of analysis does permeate all of political analysis, and it increasingly has, which, like, people are like, wait, then why the fuck are you even doing this podcast? That's like so much of what you do. I want you to know that I am a human and I do have my doubts, even though I generally believe in the work that we're doing. Like, there are moments when I step back and think, is this always productive? Are there times when it becomes counterproductive?
Yeah, and I think that kind of philosophical and thoughtful mindset is a good one to have. I do tend to agree with Mary. I think that, you know, it is good analysis to do things this way, and I don't think that what's dividing the country is the New York Times' polling methodology. But I absolutely take your point, Galen, that, you know, kind of like if politicians talk to Americans like they are segments, then we may segment ourselves, and that may not be productive. And to some extent, I think that also is true for the media as well. Although I do think that nobody trusts the media anymore, so I think that our influence is often overstated. But I do take your point, Galen, and I think it's good for anyone who speaks in that kind of segmented of a way to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, this is why, despite some others in my life at various points having wanted it, this is why I don't publish crosstab level polling averages, for example. I might publish an article analyzing crosstabs in polls, but I would never want there to be a polling average out there, because the like individual jiggles, as we were discussing earlier, are like even less meaningful at that level. And it's just too easy for people to overthink, like, oh, what if the black vote moved a point? Like, nothing.
Well,
stop.
A little Monday morning existential crisis is always healthy, right? Okay, we have one last actually good data, bad data, or not data before we close. And it's been on the back burner for a couple episodes now, so I want to make sure we actually get to it. And this example comes from the Washington Post. I think we can do this relatively quickly, but I'm reading from the Post. A few days before the first round of Los Angeles' mayoral primary, Kalshi and Polymarket gave reality TV star Spencer Pratt a 75% chance of advancing to the general election. Kalshi published campaign-style updates on his odds, and Polymarket hosted multiple active markets on whether Pratt would finish first or second in the city's nonpartisan ranked choice primary. On Kalshi alone, the mayoral race market surpassed $40 million in bets before voting ended. And then Pratt ended up badly trailing Nithya Raman, a left-wing rival, for the second slot in the general election. That pattern, a prediction market favorite ending up as a loser, has occurred several times this primary season. Candidates favored by the markets, for example, also lost in the Georgia gubernatorial primary, where a candidate endorsed by President Donald Trump lost to a healthcare executive, and in Kentucky, where longtime Representative Thomas Massie lost to a Trump-endorsed primary challenger. But people who rely on prediction markets to help them understand politics, however, aren't panicked, because these losses aren't a failure. They're a sign the markets are doing their jobs. For each of those high-profile misses in midterm primaries this year, a Post analysis found there were about 3 other elections where a favorite with a 75% chance of victory did win. The Post examined 268 candidates who received a 70 to 80% chance of winning on either Kalshi or Polymarket on any day in the 2 months prior to their primary. I have read a very long opening to a Washington Post article that all comes together to say, we checked whether or not the prediction markets were well calibrated, and we determined that they were. Is this good data, bad data, or not data?
First of all, I think this is exactly what you want to do, right? Like, we have talked about the problems with prediction markets on this podcast before, but you want to look at the data and you want to see how often they are correct. And it is the correct approach to be like, something that prediction markets give a 30% chance of happening to should happen about 3 in 10 times, right? And that is what the definition of well-calibrated is. I would love for prediction markets to be well-calibrated, and they found that they were, according to this methodology. I'm going to have to give it a bad data, though, because of something you said, Galen. The Post examined 268 candidates who received a 70 to 80% chance of winning on any day in the 2 months prior to their primary.
It's like you're reading my mind, Nathaniel.
This is not helpful. And in fact, one of the critiques I think that we've had of prediction markets is that they are way too noisy. They're very reactive to new polls or, a Trump truth or something like that. They jump around a lot. And so if you're looking at a race where one candidate went from a 30% chance to a 90% chance and then finished at a 80% chance, like that goes through the 70 to 80% range, but like that's not that helpful. And so what I would really love the Post to do is to go back and do this analysis with candidates who had a 70 to 80% chance of winning like on the morning of their primary. And if that ends up being well calibrated, then I will have more respect for prediction markets. But until then, I find it very, I find this analysis to be incomplete. And I just don't see the utility in using prediction markets particularly far out because of how noisy they are.
Yeah, to expand on that a little bit, the way that we calculated how well calibrated our election forecasts were at 538 treated every day of the forecast model in the 2 months prior to the election as a separate prediction. So we had however many races times 60 days, many predictions, right? Because we did have a separate number forecast for each race on every day. And so the model would be well calibrated if, in general, all of those forecasts were typically well calibrated, right? So that means, like, if a candidate moves over time from like 40 to 45%, like that's going to count a bunch of different times to understand the calibration. But here, they're not taking that into account at all. And I think Nathaniel's point about the noise in the prediction markets is exactly right. Yeah, at one point it was 70%, but then at another point it was 30%. And that 30% prediction was still valid. Like, you just happened to cherry pick the day you want to look at. But that 30% prediction was still a prediction, just the same as the 70% was. So I think this is close to being good data. Right. It's adjacent to good data.
Frustratingly close.
Nathaniel said straight up bad data, and it's rare that we get a full-blown call on this segment. So, Mary, am I also hearing that as
really ornery son of a bitch?
As a bad data?
I'm closer to not data because, like, here, this is why. Because this is, like, the basic idea of this methodology is on the right track. If they did one more step, I would be calling it good data.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to say it's bad.
Incomplete data.
Incomplete data, yeah.
I'm just giving you an out. So what we want to know is, for every single day that market was live, how did its prediction do? And if it ends up being well-calibrated, fantastic. It is good data on the part of the Washington Post, and it is good data on the part of these prediction markets. Mm-hmm. But until then...
we need more.
Yeah, and I suspect, and somebody should do this, maybe the Post can do it, but maybe, you guys at 50+1 or whoever. But I suspect that on the day of the election, prediction markets probably are pretty well calibrated, because I think that the people who are trading on these markets are fairly savvy consumers of data. I would expect that like a month before, I bet there's like very little. I bet it's very badly calibrated.
Well, the good news is we're going to get a lot more data very soon, Nathaniel, and I'm sure the Washington Post will listen to this podcast and apply these lessons going forward. JK. All right, that is it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Any other existential crises that anyone wants to air before we get off the call?
As a country, I am really nervous about getting over the hump of being 250 years old. There's just something different between 249 and 250. I just feel really old right now.
experiencing some sort of like midlife crisis.
It's a quarter millennium crisis.
Oh my God. Yeah, it's really.
This is all just America's quarter millennium crisis, folks. Don't worry, we're going to get through it.
That must be what I'm feeling this morning. Honestly, Nathaniel, thank you for putting words to my feeling. All right, with that, Mary and Nathaniel, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Galen.
Thanks, guys.
My name is Galen Druk. Remember to become a subscriber to this podcast at gdpolitics.com and wherever you get your podcasts. Paid subscribers get about twice the number of episodes. You can also join in our paid subscriber chat and pass along questions for us to discuss on the show. And you ensure that we can keep making a podcast that prioritizes curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. Also, be a friend of the pod and go give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Maybe even tell a friend about us. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.